Good afternoon from Vienna and Rome, and good morning or good evening if you are joining us from other locations. My name is Adnan Šerić. I'm UNIDO's staff member and organization's focal point to the T20, and also your moderator for this session. Today's event is part of UNIDO's ongoing engagement with the T20 group, in which we provide novel policy insights on how to best support a more inclusive and sustainable international production, trade, and investment system. We are pleased and honored to have gathered today a group of eminent speakers and experts on the subject topics, and we look forward to a lively debate. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our organizing partner, the International Affairs Institute, as well as co-promoting partners, Giga Institute Hamburg and IFW Kiel, for the excellent collaboration in setting the stage for today's discussion. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Ettore Greco, the Executive Vice President of the International Affairs Institute, who will deliver the opening remarks on behalf of his institution. Mr. Greco, you have the floor.
Many thanks. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. I have the great pleasure on behalf of the International Affairs Institute, Istituto Affari Internazionali of Rome, to welcome you to this webinar entitled Fostering Inclusive and Sustainable Global Value Chains, the Role of G20, which we have organized in close cooperation with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. And I wish to thank UNIDO for not only for its support, but also for helping us define the MIDIC's agenda and put together a very qualified panel of experts. Let me also thank our other two partners, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the German Institute for Global Area Studies, for their very precious cooperation and help. The webinar takes place within the framework of the Think 20, T20, which is one of the official engagement groups of the G20, this year acting under Italy's presidency of G20. Our institute is co-chair of the T20, which brings together a wide network of research institutes working on the G20 agenda and, more broadly, global governance issues. We are in particular coordinating 5 task forces of the T20, including the one dealing with trade, growth, and investment. So the task force which is more directly working on the topics we want to discuss today. The webinar's broad theme is the future of value chains, how they are evolving, the challenges associated with this evolution, and how international organizations, and specifically the G20, can contribute to make them inclusive and sustainable. This goal, as you know, is a key component of the UN Development Agenda, in particular the 9th Sustainable Development Goal. Recently, we have had some good news on the trade front. The recent WTO barometer has presented what it has called a relatively positive short-term outlook for trade, but as at the same time warn about regional disparities, continued weakness in services trade, a lagging vaccination campaign in poor countries. These are all, of course, risk factors. At the same time, as you know, a new problem has emerged, or better to say, become increasingly evident, what the economists have called the bottleneck economy, specifically post-pandemic supply bottleneck, the shortages of many products and severe supplier delays. This applies to many products and sectors, including raw materials needed to implement the green transition. For the European Union, which imports most of these materials, it has become an overriding concern. But these shortages have, of course, a negative impact also on developing countries and the whole economy as a whole. Apart from the problem of shortages, we have become increasingly aware The interdependence linked to the global supply chains poses structural problems that need to be addressed. There could be a shift from foreign to domestic inputs, and both countries and companies may seek to reduce exposures to risk by reshoring part of the industrial production. This tendency to bring production closer to home can give rise to damaging protectionist policies. But as a matter of fact, as you know, the sustainability of production in global value chains is increasingly contested, not only for the risk exposure it implies, but also for the connected social and environmental costs. We believe that only a coordinated multilateral effort can ensure a sustainable governance of global supply chains. And what we want to discuss are the new measures and initiatives that need to be taken by multilateral actors such as the G20 and other bodies, including particularly the World Trade Organization, to promote sustainability in the global production and trade systems. So I very much look forward to our discussion, that I'm sure will offer many inputs and insights, which we will do our best to integrate into the work we are doing for the G20. Without further ado, I have now the pleasure to give the floor to Hiroshi Kuniyoshi, Deputy Director of UNIDO. So, Mr. Kuniyoshi, you have the floor.
Thank you. Excellencies, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the UNIDO and International Affairs Institute joint high-level event. I'm honored to be joined on this virtual stage by our co-hosts and distinguished speakers from across the UN system, international financial institutions, public and private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is still facing the enormous health, social, and economic challenges of the coronavirus pandemic. We cannot face today's challenges alone, nor can we wait. A strong multilateral response can mitigate the brunt of the pandemic's impact. Together, we can support people and economies to deal with the fallout. The G20 offers an indispensable forum to this end. Since 2016, UNIDO has been participating in G20 deliberations. We have been an active contributor to the work of the Development Working Group, the Digital Economy Task Force, the Environmental Deputies Meeting, and the Energy Transition and Climate Sustainability Working Group. Over the same period of time, UNIDO has also supported the crucial work of the T20 and its task forces. The issues of inclusive and sustainable trade, investment, and globalization are integral to our mission, and we are pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to the multilateral policy discussions through our specialized knowledge and know-how in the areas of industrial research, policy, and statistics. Today's event provides us with opportunity to highlight some of the key areas of our ongoing work in the context of the T20, as we look forward to the upcoming T20 summit and beyond. Dear participants, to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to concentrate our efforts. So let us come together and turn the recovery from the pandemic into an opportunity for a more inclusive and sustainable future for all. I look forward to a fruitful and lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greco, and thank you, Mr. Kuniyoshi. With opening remarks behind us, we now turn to the main part of the event. First, we will listen to the keynote speech from UNIDO's Director General, Lee Yong, which is to be followed by the interventions of our distinguished panelists. Following the panel, we will open the floor to your questions. To this end, I would like to take a moment to point you to the Q&A function of the platform, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You will be able to see brief instructions on how to engage with us during this session, and we certainly look forward to your active participation throughout the event. With no further delay, I now turn to UNIDO's Director General Lee Yong and invite him to provide the backdrop to today's discussion in his keynote address. Director General, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you, Adam. The Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies, gentlemen, old friends and new friends, it's my honor to address you at today's webinar, where we will explore the role of the G20 in fostering inclusive and sustainable global value chain. I would like to thank the presidency of the G20, the government of Italy, and in particular, the G20 coordinating partner, the Institute for International Affairs, for their cooperation and support in organizing this event. I take this opportunity to also express my appreciation to our event partners at the Keough Institute for the World Economy and the GIGA Institute. I'm particularly pleased to welcome to this virtual roundtable my colleagues and fellow heads of the international organization, as well as the high-level speakers and experts from across G20 countries and beyond. Your commitment and active participation in today's event underline the importance of the subject for the global community at large. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today's event is part of UNIDO's contribution to the G20 and the T20 process in particular. I consider our work in the context of T20 as a prime example of UNIDO's leadership role in facilitating knowledge creation on policies and strategies towards the achievement of inclusive and sustainable industrial development. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, industry, manufacturing, and the productive activities are drivers of technological learning, innovation, and economic development. They are vital for job creation, sustainable livelihoods, food security, and equitable growth, and are key requirements for eradicating poverty in low and middle income countries. Today, as the world faces the twin challenges of ongoing health and the climate crisis, industrial development once again takes the center stage in the global debate and the policy making. In fact, as part of recovery efforts, industry now matters more than ever. These unprecedented challenges made it clear that we as a global community need to reinforce our commitment to a new development approach, a development approach outlined in the 2030 agenda, an approach that historically considered society, economy, and the environment, and requires us to rethink and change our production and consumption patterns. Inclusiveness and sustainability need to be placed at the core of our policy efforts to build back better. By doing so, we can create a window of opportunity for developing a more equal, just, and resilient economic system that benefits all. This brings me to a central theme of our gathering. Today's industrial system are organized and governed under the basic principles of international division of labor, trade, and investment. The global production networks, or global value chains, as they are commonly known, are the most prominent feature and a dominant force of globalization. Excellencies, more than 75% of all goods produced and traded involves global value chains, as services, raw materials, parts, and the components cross country border, often numerous times. 75% is an astonishing figure, as the concept of global value chains only dates back to a little more than 3 decades ago. In the beginning, its promise was enormous, globalizing production, involving developing countries in global trade, tapping into local skills and resources, leveraging comparative advantages, creating unprecedented efficiencies, and thus boosting demand. This led to a rise of multilateral enterprises with a true global footprint, accompanied by a growing optimism and trust in the potential of global trade to create a more inclusive and a sustainable economic model. Over the years, the globalization of value chains has positively impacted many countries, including in the developing world. The rise of China and other East Asian economies on the back of rapid industrialization serves as a testimony to the economic development potential unleashed through the integration and technological upgrading in global value chain. And however, already at the beginning of the new millennium, it became evident that the extent and nature of participation in value chains varied across country sectors, with benefits unevenly distributed among and within countries, particularly the least developed countries. Public discourse emerged around certain industries where the issue of fair production and trade practices along the value chain become the apparent fallacy of the globalized production model. That led some commentators to conclude that in the absence of appropriate guidelines and regulatory mechanism, the global value chain model of production hindered social inclusiveness and environmental sustainability and needed rethinking. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the recent crisis and the external shocks which a global economy has suffered offers a tangible opportunity to rethink existing ideas on how countries can become part and benefit from global value chains. In this regard, as we aim to build back better by using forward-looking policies, we must not forget to place the objective of accelerating inclusive and sustainable transformation at the core of our efforts. We can do so in at least 3 ways. First, we can stimulate inclusiveness by focusing our policy efforts on building state-of-the-art capabilities in small and medium enterprises, which are the backbone of the most economies, fostering innovative, socially and environmentally friendly business models and solutions. Through financing, entrepreneurship and a skill development program offer another possibility for bringing women, youth, and disadvantaged groups in the global economy. Second, we can stimulate sustainability through the smart regulation, including a new generation of trade and investment agreements. It is crucial to engage and tackle illegal practices throughout the value chains actively. To this end, we need more concentrated, coordinated efforts among governments to strengthen legislations and enforcement mechanisms in this area. And thirdly, we need to increase our joint effort towards strengthening multilateral approaches to policymaking. A starting point may be creating specialized global platforms that gather evidence on policies that work, distill lessons learned, and drive the informal public discourse on the subject matter. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the G20 is the forum to seek agreement on these proposals, while the G20 offers an appropriate platform to further develop those ideas. I hope today's event will contribute towards the creation of a common policy agenda on how to foster inclusive and sustainable global value chains. UNIDO, Excellencies, stands ready to be a partner in this process. I wish you an exciting, productive webinar this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Director General, for the excellent insights into the session's overarching theme. We now move forward with our panel. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome to the discussion our first distinguished speaker, Mr. Piercarlo Paduan, who is the current Vice President of the International Affairs Institute and formerly Managing Director at the IMF, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, as well as the Chief Economist of the OECD, and former Italian Minister of Economy and Finance. A truly impressive track record. Mr. Paduan, discussions around sustainability in global trade and GVCs, or global value chains, have been part of G20's deliberations for a while now. What is your view on the current political support for moving forward on the sustainability agenda, especially against the backdrop of the ongoing pandemic? Does the crisis offer a window of opportunity to advance on the sustainability front, and what is now expected from the G20 and other multilateral actors? You have the floor.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon to all colleagues and those who are listening to this webinar. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to contribute to this discussion. Indeed, as it has already been mentioned, the COVID crisis has generated tremendous shocks in the global economy and its governance. And so it is appropriate that the G20 as a multilateral body takes up this issue and finds suggestions in how to re-strengthen multilateral governance after the pandemic. Let me first recall what are the backdrop of the structural evolution of international trade relations nowadays. At the risk of being overly pessimistic, I would say that there are two negative trends which are pervasive in the trade relations and investment relations nowadays. One is the fact that we have observed a so-called decoupling of trade from GDP growth. We used to, as economists, look at GDP growth driven mostly by international trade and further trade integration. Now we see that trade is weakening and GDP growth is also, of course, weakening, but for different reasons. And a second element, which is closely linked to the first one, is that with slower trade growth, we see increasing fragmentation and divergence, which makes it even more difficult to find basis and material pushes for further trade integration, but also brings a point home with respect to the topic that we are discussing today. What is the future of global value chains as the backbones of international trade relations? And what can we do to strengthen the backbones of global value chains so that we can find new ways to further deepen multilateralism? This is a question which has taken the floor many times in the past, although not with the same insight. You will all remember the debate after the breakdown of the global system in the 1980s and 90s, the debate about the future of regionalism. Many would foresee the future of international trade relations as being centered on a number of regional agreements, some of which might be closed rather than open, make it protectionist threats more visible. Now, the question that I would like to share with my colleagues is, are we witnessing yet another form of regionalism by which global value chains shrink a little bit towards a more regional dimension rather than expanding, becoming global? And the political effort which was raised by the questions I was addressed, the political issue is, would politicians or political classes prefer to develop regional agreements rather than more lengthy and heavy lifting multilateral agreements in a context in which strengthening multilateralism is more difficult than in the past? This is where we have to be careful and not to be too pessimistic. So I immediately warn my colleagues against this additional possibility. One could see one scenario by which the global value chains at large evolve towards more regional arrangements and structures in their respective areas of influence therefore weakening the benefits of multilateralism and weakening the benefits of positive spillovers and interaction. Or global value chains and regional agreements may become even more integrated if we take into account one other piece of evidence, that is the following. Global economic integration or disintegration today is not just about trade, it's not just about trade and investment, it's about issues such as technology, such as taxation policies, such as migration. The point is very simple. It is probably impossible to speak of a truly deglobalization trend. We will witness different forms of globalization, and one of the differences may be to what extent different forms of globalization can be governed by a multilateral approach. This is the real challenge, and the challenge is made it even stronger if we consider that much of the policy dialogue going on at the global level is about what has been called soft governance, meaning that we may be too optimistic in seeking full-fledged multilateral agreements, but we cannot ignore that there are soft relationships going and being built in the global system because of this proliferation of issue areas. One generates therefore a typical benefits of global integration and governance, which is the benefits of issue linkages. Governments can exploit the fact that there is a table where several issues are put on it simultaneously, and therefore the options for further collective agreements are increased if you accept issue linkages and exchange of benefits in multilateral negotiations. So this is my point about governance, which I would also strengthen by the following notation. We are in a situation in which, in spite of multilateralism being weakened, the role of global public goods is even more important. And global public goods are a quintessential element of multilateral agreement, which needs to be strengthened. This today, to me, seems to be even more appropriate as, and here's my final point, we recognize the increasing role of the ESG paradigm, environmental, social, and governance sustainability, which by definition calls for a multiple issue linkage across the board. And the fact that this is a reason of optimism for the future is that this is being fed and developed not only by public policy and institutional actors, but also by the private sector, who finds it profitable and interesting to apply the ESG paradigm to their activity. So we have a combination of positive factors that need to be governed. This is where the G20 comes in. The G20 must retain its leadership in building up a new paradigm of sustainable growth, even in spite of the fact that the COVID crisis has introduced deep flaws in the system and deep scars in the system. But we can rebuild on those scars. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Padon, for your excellent remarks. And to pick up maybe on the last point of the ESG, changing ESG paradigm on the side of the private sector, there are also now increasing efforts on the regulatory side, in fact, to mainstream some of those ESG requirements into global value chains. And at present, there is a lively debate going on in a number of countries about the need for specific legislation to be introduced in order to ensure uptake of socially and environmentally responsible practices in global supply chains. Germany is one of those countries where recent deliberations have led to the proposal of a Due Diligence Act, which has been now submitted to the Parliament for consideration. And the legal act is meant to require companies to take responsibility for their supply chains and make globalization more socially just. Having said that, I'm pleased to introduce our next panelist, Mr. Norbert Butler, who's the Parliamentary State Secretary in Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, one of the key actors in the legislative effort. Mr. Bartlett, can we already draw some lessons from your country's experience with that process and also derive some recommendations on possible future role of the multilateral community in this regard? You have the floor.
Thank you, Adnan. I'll do my very best and really appreciate to be, it's a great pleasure for me to be part of this webinar and of this meeting. So Director General Lee, Vice President Greco, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, we in Germany, we think the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us very drastically why we need sustainable and fair global supply chains. The virus has caused a global health crisis with more than 171 million confirmed infections and over 3.6 million deaths. At top speed, this health crisis has turned into a multiple crisis that threatens health, economic development, stability, and peace worldwide. Supply and delivery chains broke down overnight. This resulted in shortages of intermediate products, resources, and cargo capacity, for example, in the car and IT industries, and with regard to the supply of masks, medical protective clothing, and drugs. Supply chains became shorter. In many places, they became more regional. And the crisis has affected all countries, rich and poor, stable and fragile alike. And it has affected the poorest most. According to the ILO figures, 250 million jobs have been lost. The United Nations estimates that the number of people in extreme poverty increased by up to 124 million people in 2020. And worldwide, an additional up to 132 million people were affected by chronic hunger in 2020. And as debt levels rise, countries are finding it harder to invest in a sustainable recovery. So sustainable global value chains are even more urgently needed than before. Resilient value chains make global supply links more stable. Fair value chains increase people's resilience against crisis, and they help to make globalization fair. We are all responsible for making economic activities environmentally and socially sustainable. Enterprises too have to assume even more responsibility for the consequences of their operations. Environmental degradation and human rights violations are still widespread in many supply chains. There are still starvation wages in textile factories and forced labor and child labor in mines and quarries. That is scandalous, and we must not accept it. So we have to use the post-COVID recovery to make corporate due diligence in global supply chains the new standard. People in producer countries finally need decent jobs and living incomes. Due diligence obligations is possible. Many companies are setting a good example, but we cannot just rely on voluntary commitments. That is why the German government has prepared a due diligence act based on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. What do we want to achieve through that law? First, higher social standards in global supply chains. We want made in Germany to mean both top quality and top social standards. And second, level playing field. Many German businesses are already applying the highest standards in their production. Others are not yet doing so. And third, transparency in supply chains helps companies to optimize their processes and minimize risks. In the medium and long term, that helps to save costs and safeguard production, even in a crisis. And fourth, legal clarity. The law will define for the first time which specific requirements companies have to meet in order to fulfill their due diligence obligations. We need a smart mix of voluntary and binding, governmental and private sector measures, multi-stakeholder partnerships and cooperation, and a dialogue with our partner governments. Making global supply chains fair and sustainable is a task in which both policymakers and private enterprises have to engage. That is why the German government assists companies in meeting their due diligence obligations. The German government's help desk on business and human rights has already provided tailor-made confidential advice to 800 companies to help them identify risks in their supply chains and find suitable support programs. We also support voluntary industry initiatives such as the Textiles Partnership and the German Initiative on Sustainable Cocoa. I'm sure that the draft German Due Diligence Act will lend further impetus to the efforts for legislation at the EU level, and it will send important signals to the international debate, for instance, at today's event. So, ladies and gentlemen, together with international organizations, the private sector and civil society, we are working for fair and sustainable global supply chains where standards apply to all players. Let us jointly take action, practical and immediate action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett, for your insightful perspective. Moving on to the next panelist, Ms. Beata Jaworczyk, who is the Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or EBRD. She's one of the world-leading experts on globalization and international organization of production, and therefore in possibly the best position to give us her unique perspective on the question of how to balance the trade-offs between economic growth and social and environmental sustainability, which often have a greater bearing for developing supplier countries. Furthermore, we have now heard of compliance costs to environmental and social standards, be they mandatory or not, that predominantly fall on firms that reside in buyer countries, those countries that often have stricter due diligence laws, for instance. Ms. Jaworczyk, we heard now from Mr. Bartlett that we need to ensure a level playing field. What could be concrete steps by the G20 and the wider multilateral community to ensure that level playing field between buyers and suppliers in global value chains?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be joining today's discussion. So let me make 3 suggestions on what can be done by G20, the international community, and national governments. First, I think we need clear messaging about commitments to sustainability. Now, uncertainty associated with the pandemic has not gone away. And if we compound this uncertainty by the lack of clear information about where policies of national governments are going with respect to market access, with respect to local regulation, we are only going to hurt the recovery. I actually worry that we are going to see countries splitting into 2 groups. There will be countries where governments will embrace green transition. They will make very clear commitment. They will send a strong signal to firms to adjust, to invest in innovation, to invest in R&D, to tailor their products and processes to new requirements. And then there will be countries that will either make no commitment or will be given mixed messaging to their citizens. And in those countries, firms and entrepreneurs will not take the necessary steps. And as the rest of the world moves on and increases the standards, those countries will fall further behind and they will find themselves unable to export eventually. Now note that domestic policies matter very much for exporting. Often it's simply not possible or not practical to have a different production process for exports and for the domestic market. So if you have a firm that exports only a small share of its output, and it's maybe not worthwhile for that firm to invest in order to make its products green, because if the majority of the production goes to the domestic market, its products will be undercut by other producers who are not subject to stringent requirement. Now, it's very hard for politicians to commit to green policies beyond paying lip service to that. And that's obvious because the costs of those policies are felt today, while the benefits may be visible only after their term in the office is over. So, and this is where G20 comes in, right? We need to tie the hands of governments through international agreements. We need to help politicians make credible commitments to their citizens by having international commitments to which multiple countries sign up. Second, we need to reduce information asymmetries. 2 years ago, so prior to the pandemic, the EBRD surveyed 20,000 firms in emerging markets. And we asked them, if you haven't invested in energy saving measures, why was that? 2/3 of firms said it wasn't a priority relative to other investments. And what was really striking was that there wasn't a big difference between large firms and small firms in terms of the answer. And only less than a fifth of firms cited financial constraints. So what this tells me is that firms are unwilling to invest in making their production more sustainable because they simply are uncertain about future regulation. They are uncertain about the payoff from doing so. And here governments can come in by subsidizing energy audits. They can come in by having very clear commitment to policies. And of course, there is a role for multilateral development banks to provide financing for green projects. I'm happy to say that the EBRD is very active in this space. Recently, we have participated also in the first sustainability-linked bond in our countries of operation. And the idea behind this bond was very simple. A large electricity producer in Greece committed to very aggressive reduction in CO2 emissions. If these reductions are achieved, they will be facing very low interest rate when repaying the bond holders. If, however, they fail to reduce emissions, a higher interest rate will kick in. And the role of EBRD there is to serve as the seal of approval, to give guarantee to other investors that indeed the activities will be monitored, that it is a credible commitment, and in this way to crowd in private investment, and also to create demonstration effects so that other investments of this type can follow. The third point I want to make is we should be paying more attention to state-owned enterprises. Many stranded assets are in the hands of state-owned enterprises. In regions where the EBRD operate, SOEs are the owners of or account for a large share of employment in the coal industry. And this is an opportunity for governments to work with state-owned enterprises to wind down these stranded assets while taking care of workers who will be affected by this transition to net zero. And it is also an opportunity to use state-owned enterprises for demonstration effects. In France or in Germany, it was actually SOEs that often embraced climate-related financial disclosure. And I think SOEs in emerging markets can play this role as well. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Horchik, for your overview, insightful comments. We are now moving to our next speaker, who is Ms. Pamela Koch Hamilton, the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. And we are certainly delighted to have you with us today. Ms. Koch Hamilton, we are moving away from large enterprises, the SOEs that tend to be that Beata was referring to in her intervention, to the issue of SMEs. And a big part of the debate around inclusiveness in global value chains centers on the role of small and medium-sized enterprises. And much of your work at the ITC focuses on providing support to governments and other actors to facilitate entry of precisely those enterprises into global value chains. And certainly more importantly, to ensure that they also benefit from such participation. In your view, what are the three key policy pillars the G20 should consider embracing to open up opportunities for greater participation of small and medium-sized enterprises in global value chains? Ms. Koch Hamilton, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I think these are critical questions that we need to have answered, and I'll be happy to engage. You know, from the small businesses in Colombia farming and processing sustainable cocoa, to the medium-sized firms in Morocco manufacturing or personal protective equipment, to the Senegalese fintech firm enabling cheaper and faster payments, or the Ugandan tech entrepreneurs working on enhancing Wi-Fi connections to the small tourism operators in the Caribbean. They all essentially want the same thing when aiming to trade across borders. They want transparency, predictability, and opportunity. How then do we make global and regional supply chains work for these micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises? We already know they make up the vast majority of productive labor globally and will be central to the recovery. So let us find a way to better integrate them into these value chains. I therefore see three pillars to work on, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of them later in the discussion. First of all, mainstream and facilitate compliance to international standards. Standards and certifications are essential to international trade and participation in global value chains. ITC standards map data show that companies are more likely to export when they comply with international standards by more than 30% in export value. Unfortunately, the smaller the company, the less likely it is to have an internationally recognized quality certificate and hence to be able to export. Information on how to comply is not easily available or simply explained, and the cost to implement the required measures are often too high for some MSMEs. As an example, let us look at African firms, where about 60% of large businesses had either a safety, quality, or sustainability certificate, compared with 51% of medium-sized firms, 37% of small businesses, and 21% of micro firms. Certification is likely to become even more important after this COVID-19 crisis. As global value chains reorganize, buyers will increasingly demand their suppliers follow sanitary and sustainable standards of production. Making information on standards and technical regulations accessible to firms is crucial for MSMEs to signal the quality of their goods to new buyers across borders. There's a specific role for government and development institutions to support the certification process, in particular in integrating those features when setting up one-stop portals to disseminate standards-related information to the private sector. Our Green to Compete hubs, 3 in Asia, 2 in Africa, 1 in the Caribbean, and 1 in South America, serve as service provider platforms for these MSMEs to diversify their certification strategy. The second pillar, support innovation and digital technologies. Digital technologies already flourishing before the pandemic hit have now become essential to access market intelligence and to conduct sales and obtain supplies online. Businesses operating online were able to avoid the full effect of the pandemic as consumers shifted to electronic commerce. The ITC Global COVID-19 Business Impact Survey shows that firms that used e-commerce weathered the crisis better than others did. About 10% of firms selling online increased their sales during the COVID-19 crisis, more than twice the share of firms not selling online. In sub-Saharan Africa, 17% of companies that invested significantly in R&D adopted agile strategies to deal with the pandemic, as against 9% of those that have not. The contrast is even starker for emerging economies. You'll be able to find, of course, extensive data on the matter in our upcoming SME Competitiveness Outlook report, which will be launched at the occasion of the MSME Day on 27th of June. The main takeaway here for government is that investments in digital skills, digital access, as well as in the quality and reliability of local internet connections would allow small and remote companies to develop new products according to market trends and take advantage of digital opportunities, and at the end, to better integrate into global value chains. The third pillar, promote sustainability. As the recovery advances, lead firms in value chains are adopting sustainability standards to secure sustainable supplies, and governments in importing countries are adopting environmental regulations. These new climate policies, regulations, laws, and taxes may lead to regulatory risks for small firms. MSMEs need to be able to fulfill these green rules in order to access opportunities in global value chains and leverage them for local livelihood and environmental improvements. Unfortunately, the evidence suggests that many small firms are still struggling to rise to the occasion. 27% of the businesses interviewed by ITC said that environmental regulations were an obstacle to their operations. There are financial costs associated with becoming compliant and fees incurred for non-compliance. We all know that climate change is upon us. Coming from the Caribbean, this is our daily life. We cannot allow opaque and confusing regulations and costs to keep small businesses in developing countries operating in sectors and in ways that harm the people and societies that they engage with. While the transition to sustainable practices can be perceived as a challenge, it also provides an opportunity for MSMEs to strengthen their competitiveness and resilience. However, for this, they need support to transition. National investments in sustainable production processes can help MSMEs secure high-value export opportunities. We need to look at transfer of green technologies, better use of South-South cooperation and trilateral or triangular cooperation to exchange know-how. And we must urge the private sector, the large provider sector, to understand the business and, yes, the moral case of working with MSMEs in small island developing states, least developed countries, to improve their green footprint. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Cook-Hamilton, for sharing ITC experiences and recommendations for the G20. This was a truly interesting and highly relevant intervention. You concluded on the note of having a higher commitment from the private sector towards the sustainability agenda. And we are now turning, in fact, to the business perspective on some of the issues we've been talking about this afternoon. I'm pleased we are joined by Mr. Marco Felisati, who is the B20, so the Business 20 of the G20, Sherpa and Deputy Director at Conf Industria. Mr. Felisati, sustainability and inclusiveness across the global value chains remains a challenge for many companies. In your view, what actions can businesses take to recalibrate their supply chains towards sustainability and inclusiveness in order to better support global efforts undertaken at the level of the G20 and beyond? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good day to everybody. Excellencies, Mr. Greco, Mr. Padoan, and distinguished panelists and colleagues. I'm very grateful for the invitations, and I'm happy to contribute to this panel discussion as we have a close and fruitful collaboration with the Think 20 to make the Italian G20 presidency a success. Just a few words on the B20, since you have mentioned with over 2,000 representatives, we gather a community of over 6.5 million companies. And we are about to conclude the drafting of 9 policy papers on most relevant priorities of the global agenda. Their outcomes will be disclosed in a final communique on 8th of October at the occasion at the B20 summit. Let me come now to the subject issue. My first remark is that ensuring more resilient and sustainable global value chain takes a center stage in many of our task forces from different angles and perspectives, primarily in those dedicated to trade and investment, to finance and infrastructures, to integrity and compliance, energy and resource efficiencies as well. We have a dedicated action council on sustainability and global emergencies, and the very issues is dealt with in the digital transformations and health and life science and employment and education task forces. So we have a large view over it. To come to your question, let me stress a threefold basic assumption that stands behind our vision. First of all, we are concerned about the calls to reshoring global value chains, localized productions, and decouple economies. We think that more diversifications and not less increases the scope for businesses to cushion systemic shocks. Secondly, a large debate is ongoing on global value chains resilience, but in our view, they have shown indeed remarkable capabilities by ramping up global sourcing, productions, and distribution, whereas we think that resilience building has a lot to do with international governance and regulatory frameworks in paving the way for sustainable businesses to intercept market drivers. Thirdly, it has been stressed, and I'm happy, there is no trade-off between competitiveness and sustainability. On the contrary, complying with high sustainability standards is a competitiveness factor, and being competitive is a prerequisite for a global value chain to be sustainable and inclusive. So the very question is how to support such a virtuous loop. And against this scenario, the first action is to free companies' resources by removing tariff and, most of all, regulatory bottlenecks, by harmonizing standards, and by supporting small business in accessing global markets. And this is something that neither business can do alone, nor it can be done by a few states. Most of the solutions, and it has been underlined, are to be sought at multilateral level, especially within the WTO. But G20 countries can lead by examples in many fields, such as promoting guidelines for crisis response to support business, developing risk management and risk mitigation strategies. And this, of course, goes beyond the pandemic crisis, looking ahead at regrettably possible other future systemic threats or disruptions. Another key lever is upgrading and digitizing custom processes. It might seem a very technical nitty-gritty items, but during the crisis, the average time for shipping clearance increased by nearly 30 times worldwide. And up to 7% of the total value of international trade is still absorbed by documentation costs. So there is a huge room for improvement over there. Thirdly, by filling the gap between the demand and the supply of trade finance that prevents many sustainability-oriented companies, especially small, to access global markets. The unmet demand for global trade finance has approached some 3.5 trillion US dollar. And in 2018, before the pandemic crisis, the WTO reported that 60% of trade finance requests by micro, small and medium business were rejected against just 7% for multinational companies. And this is something we should take care of. A second action is fostering sustainable finance, and in particular, ESG and impact investments. ESG investments seek to reduce risks and avoid harm by including as a metric companies' impact on environmental, social, and governance factors, whereas impact investment goes even further by proactively seeking a sort of do-good approach rather than a do-not-harm one. And as it has been said, many companies already voluntarily disclose ESG's information, and this helps improve risk management and reinforce the interest of investors on ESG-attentive companies. But it requires a key enabling factor, that is the availability of reliable and comparable ESG information. Impact investment is to generate a measurable social and environmental impact alongside financial returns, and it can be considered an evolution compared to ESG. However, it is of paramount importance having international consistent reporting frameworks and coherent guidelines on how to measure, report, and compare impacts. A third vector of action under the B20 lens regards integrity and compliance. The concept of supply chain integrity is mirrored in international frameworks like the OECD guidelines for multinationals or the UN guiding principle on business and human rights. And as it has been underlined, business already carried out many voluntary initiatives in training and providing guidance on responsible business conduct. And a concrete example of how this is increasingly relevant is the constant diffusion of integrity and compliance officers at senior level. However, since the objective is to promote best practices all along the entire supply chain, this may work better in large companies, and there is a need to design measures that can be more easily adoptable by small and medium companies as well. In this regard, many companies of all sizes are investing in compliance programs involving their suppliers, their contractors, and their stakeholders. And to conclude on this very issue, another key notion regards human rights and corruption risk assessments. And again, it is of paramount importance to support building capacities in non-OECD countries that may have less ambitious governance objectives and a lower degree of enforcement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Felisati, for offering this interesting business perspective on the subject matter. Now, many highly important countries for global value chains are still at the low or middle income stages and are not represented in the G20. And therefore, their interests may not always align with those of the big players. So how can they be heard and involved in any attempt at multilateral action aimed at global value chains? So our next panelist will be able to provide a perspective on that matter. Unfortunately, Ms. Barcena had a last-minute change in plans and will not be able to join us. Instead, we are pleased to have Mr. Mario Cimoli, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Cimoli, thank you for being with us today. I would like to ask, in what way can international organizations, such as the UN, contribute to sustainable governance of global value chains? And are there specific lessons to be learned from your past and ongoing work and programs in the Latin America and Caribbean region? You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to have 5 points, I think, that addressing in the question that you make. And first of all, I heard a lot about cooperation, governance, post-pandemic building back better, global value chain with more equality, more social inclusion, every good and political correct word. That is fine. That is great. My point is going to be a little bit different because I want to put clearly another view and another point of reference on this issue. And I have the first of all, what we have learned recently after the crisis of 2008, what is impact of the process of globalization, or what we call hyper-globalization without no regulation in production and manufacturing. What we have learned, that the global value chain in production and manufacturing process is really important to sustain income, middle income class, and so on. What's happened? We created with this not agreement, with this not regulation, with this not governance, we create an enormous tension in different countries. This tension that we have today in post-pandemic era is not only the result of these processes, it's the result of what's happened in 2008 and before. And you can accept immediately, if you compare the political debate in different regions around the world, this expression, what is the middle income class, the capability to increase income in different countries, in Europe, in the United States, and so on, in many Latin America, this is clear. What do we have learned? That manufacturing, global value chain has to be addressed to incorporate and expand middle income class. That is crucial because in this way, it is the only way to reduce poverty and to decrease equality. That is fine. What I've learned about that is that what for us is difficult, this is what we learn clearly that countries are not similar. What we learn that countries are not symmetric. Many times we make analysis also here in different ways. We thought about what's happening with the global value chain, with production, with technology, with innovation, whatever we want to put there. And we think in our main, giving the message that countries are symmetrical. But country and processes are very asymmetrical. Asymmetry has to be the main point to include in the debate that's coming up in the next G20. Because you can clear what's happening with the vaccines. If you can understand immediately what happened, the asymmetry that you have with the vaccine, the capability of country, not only industrial, to diffuse, to include, and to have. If you didn't think that we are going to create the global value chain very equal, very expanded for everybody, but on the cases where we have this pandemic with this enormous impact, and we don't have the capability to governance globally vaccines, this clear asymmetry. If we don't put in our document, asymmetry has important, but it's crucial. What are the asymmetries that are important? This is only, what happened with the vaccine is only the result of the process. It's not only because you have the vaccines, because you have a moral ethic. You can see clearly what's happening. What is the asymmetry? History of industrial policy. We have our colleagues, Norbert from Germany. We have the colleagues from China. We have this enormous asymmetry. What is industrial policy in Germany, China, and America? For example, what's happening in Latin America, and the agreements that reflect that. We have to think about the global value chain with this enormous asymmetry of history of industrial policy. I think it's necessary to include industrial policy one, the capability to sustain industrial and manufacturing. You remember when everybody said that manufacturing and industry is not important, that manufacturing is not to be the crucial point. Manufacturers continue to be important and crucial for distribution, for income, for increased middle income classes. We understand after this pandemic process that manufacturing is a key issue. It's a key issue for Latin America too, because it's the only way to expand industry, to create diversification, to sustain wages. In that case, for us, it's very important to say clearly that industry has to be part of this process. The dialogue has to be taken into account this asymmetry. Take the case of Europe. Europe has a plan of 550 billion euros. United States had a plan of 80 trillion euros. Both regions has an independent central bank. And we are trying, middle income countries, as is the same of these areas. No, come on. Also for industrial policy, it's not the same. If we don't put clear, this is the debate. I think we continue to far this, that I like it very much, this our meeting, but it's completely different. Asymmetry is, this is another way. The access to market is another way. If it takes the case of Portugal, of Lisboa, where the Minister of Finance are willing to control imports through the CO participation of products, that could be good for Europe, but it could be a problem for Latin America that only contribution to CO2 of the global economy only for the 8%. There is also an asymmetry there. There is a penalization also there. And I think the coming of the new industrial policy, what's happening in these three regions that Piercarlo said, is a new industrial policy, taking national countries. And we are going to say, we can think between us that everything is symmetric. It's not symmetric, it's very asymmetrical. If we don't put clear in our G20 what is this asymmetry, it's very difficult to have a global economy that supports inclusion, production, and capability. And that is, for example, what China did in terms of creation of jobs in incorporating middle-income class, what is difficult to do for other countries. Asymmetry is very important. Asymmetry, to take this asymmetry in our debate on capability. The other point that is crucial is regionalism. And I want to say the difference, if these are concluded, is the part and the fight together. Latin America is doing well recently because the natural resources increase in prices. That is good. But it's not when you have growth, probably is to have good rate of growth for the next year. That is good. It's recovering. But it's recovering with the same process of production. There is no structural changes. You have growth with the growing informality. More than the 50 people, you have an informality, low productivity and informality. Many other countries looking for investment in Latin America, but don't create it global value chain. That is not only a problem of the global condition, also the policy making in the region have an enormous problem on that, because industrial policy and technology has been not applied in the wealth thing also in this region. But these processes of regionalization is putting middle-income countries out of the scenario. And I think if we think that, for example, the debt condition is what's happening in many countries in this region and others, in Africa also, debt condition reflect what you have the external constraint. Your capabilities don't create it to absorb inputs and so on and so on. We know what is happening. But this is clear. Regionalization, it is coming the new pattern of growth, but producing the same result, more informality, low productivity, no dialogue. Conclusion. We need to discuss and we need to have an enormous debate in collaboration and industrial policy. If Europe want to create a pharmaceutical sector, but stay alone, go ahead. If China want to do the same, go ahead. If America want to do the same, go ahead. But if there is no dialogue, you can understand also the new pandemic process is going to be a disaster again. We need not only dialogue in what is, moving products. We need dialogue also in absorbing this asymmetry for a dialogue and industrial and technological policy. If we don't do that, also what is going to happen in the long term is creating global value chain, is creating instability, social production instability in different areas of our global thing. Latin America is ready to do that, but it's also important organization as NIDO to support this dialogue. What is important to coming out in this G20, not only is coming a new era of industrial policy, new era for manufacturing policy, absorb this asymmetry to produce a dialogue on industrial and technological policy and capability. That is a very important point. If we don't do that, we are creating new process where countries have to remain closer than they corner and don't expand the economy in the global social inclusion process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cimoli, for this very passionate perspective on what needs to be done in the context of global value chains and policy making, and also offering this perspective from Latin America. In fact, you are closing a bit the loop in that respect, because Director General Lee Young mentioned in his speech that industry now matters more than ever. And you are in fact highlighting that industrial policy, or new focus on industrial policy, is probably also now more important than ever. In fact, this is a lot of the work that we do at UNIDO at present goes exactly in that direction, and I was very happy to hear that. This also concludes the first part of our today's event. Thank you to all of our outstanding speakers for their excellent insights. We are very good in time, in fact, so I now pass the baton to Mr. Fabrizio Botti, who is the Senior Fellow at the International Affairs Institute, who will be your moderator for the Q&A session. Thank you very much once more, and Fabrizio, over to you.
Many thanks, Adnan. On behalf of the Institute of International Affairs, Instituto Affari Internazionali, I would like to say thank you very much to the Director General of UNIDO, Li Yong, for his keynote address, and Deputy Kunyoshi for his welcome remarks, and of course to all the panelists for their very valuable contribution to the development of the debate on the issue of GVCs sustainability in the framework of the G20 Italy process. And of course, also thank you very much to our cooperating partners, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. As mentioned by Anand at the beginning of the panel, it is possible to send questions to the speakers to the Q&A function of the Zoom platform. But let me start first. Let me leave the floor first for a brief intervention and hopefully a question to the participants to Ligia Zagato. She's an industrial development expert at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization in New York, of course. And she's co-authored two policy briefs of the G20 Italy Task Force on Trade, Investment, and Growth. One on the G20 potential contribution to the integration of MSMEs into value chains, and another one on sustainability of supply chains. Please, Ligia, the floor is yours. It could be interesting to add some from the work of the two group of authors into the task force 3 of the T20. Ligia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Thank you for the opportunity of introducing the ongoing T20 work made by UNIDO on the subject of how to foster inclusive and sustainable GVCs, which is taking place in collaboration with a range of partner institutes from G20 countries. The two policy briefs which we are developing under the Task Force 3, PB1 and PB12, focus on the very issues of today's discussions, namely the requirements for due diligence in supply chains and policies to foster the inclusion of small and medium enterprises into GVCs. Two of the key recommendations coming out of these policy briefs are the following. First, we propose to have G20 as a forum for exchange and coordination to achieve a level playing field in the spirit of the OECD G20 collaboration on tax evasion. And two, the launch of the Link 20 initiative by G20 member states, which is to include a fund and a multilateral platform to provide technical and policy assistance to strengthen inter-firm linkages, particularly those between SMEs and multinational companies. With this in mind, my question for the panel is the following. What is your take on G20 member state readiness at present to take up such proposals? And what else would you recommend in relation to these suggestions? This is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ligia, for your questions. It's a very interesting question. I would like to propose it to our panel. I see in particular a couple of issues in works that you are doing as authors in the Task Force on Trade, Investment and Growth. As you know, I'm coordinating that group. And you also proposed the G20 as a forum for exchange and coordination to achieve a level playing field. And in the same spirit of the OECD G20 collaboration on tax evasion, this is a very interesting key message, preliminary key message coming from your words. I would like to ask to Mr. Bartel, what is your opinion on the G20 member states' readiness to take up on such a proposal, and what else would you recommend in relation to this kind of suggestion?
Thank you very much, Fabrizio Botti, for this question. I think Germany is on the way to have this law, as I mentioned in my speech. I think we in Germany will final our consultations and our process to finalize this law in the middle of June this year. Then the law is in order, and then we go on in the European level. I hope that Commissioner Reinders, he said that he will have a law for next year for sustainable supply chains, and I hope that the European law will be similar to the German law. So I hope that our law that we are going on to decide, the government has decided it in 3rd of March this year, and the first round in the parliament has been in April. And as I mentioned, the second round will be at the 10th or 11th of June. And then we have finalized our law process. And then all companies with more than 3,000 employees will be under this law. And I hope that the European initiative will be going on to finalize the European process to get a law at least 2022. So this will be the process, and I think our German law will be like a master plan for the European process, because we have a law that is in a good situation between having strong regulations for the companies, but also possibilities for the companies to fulfill this law. No company must be successful in avoiding human rights violations if it cannot do it. Every company has to do this, what is able to do. And that's our opinion, that we help the companies to analyze, they have to report, and we help them to avoid all violations of human rights, but they are not in the situation that they can change a situation in some regions of China or in some regions of South Africa or where else. But they have to look at this, and they have to try to get better conditions in human rights and in social standards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bartel, for your response. Alicia Salgado, you also, while presenting the state of the art of the policy piece, were contributing in the framework of the G20 Italy Task Force on Trade, Investment and Growth. Another proposal was to launch an initiative by the G20 to promote at the G20 level policy and technical assistance for strengthening inter-firm linkages between SMEs and multinational firms. Do you see any potential at the G20 level to reach a consensus on that, or?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I would be very grateful if it could actually happen, and the sooner the better. I think that there is potential. The necessity to ensure that we have a greater synergy and also a greater insertion of MSMEs with multinational corporations will do two things. One, it will help to stabilize the capacity of the MSMEs to be inserted in a real way in international global value chains, particularly given what has happened with COVID. We've seen what has happened, the fallout, especially in so many areas, particular tourism and the shortening of global value chains, etc. But also secondly, when we have a greater insertion of MSMEs or a greater synergy, the multinational corporations can also, in a sense, have more reliance on the stability of their own global value chains for inputs, for the requirements that they need to continue to function. So it's my hope that the G20 would be able to not just encourage this, but actively promote it and incorporate it in an agreement. I think it works for everyone, and I think it would be something that would actually help to stabilize the global value chain processes. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are, of course, open to any other reaction for other panelists. Just raise the hand in the proper function in the Zoom platform. You find it on the bottom. Next interesting question coming from the audience is for Mr. Piercarlo Padoan. Piercarlo Padoan, the European Commission recent communication on the trade policy review shows that the EU is aware that it will not achieve the Green Deal objective on its own, that the EU is prepared to take measures to ensure input compliance with increasingly stringent domestic regulations. What opportunities and challenges would see on greening international trade through EU regulation and standardization as those presented by the Commission?
Thanks very much. That's a very challenging point you're putting on the table, and for which my answer remains tentative. I think that with all great processes of change and transformation, we must accept differences in speed of adaptation. In other words, there are different propensities to go green, both at the global level and within the European Union. So we must find a way to identify leaders in terms of policies and countries that can go ahead and introduce regulations and legislation that supports adoption of green technologies and of green production, even if that does not imply full agreement from scratch, from the beginning. However, we must exploit the benefits, so to speak, of the COVID crisis also from another point of view, the point of view that I think it's widely recognized that once we go back to normal after the COVID crisis impact has faded away, the normal we will see will be different from the normal we used to see a year ago. And this is true also for going green. Going green in, let's face it, going green in some parts of Southern Europe means different things to going green in Northern Europe or the Scandinavian countries. This does not mean that we should not, and we should aim at the best. We should, however, be cognizant of the fact that in order to adapt and introduce transformations in going green, we need to look at the social costs of transformation, of adaptation, with the purpose of minimizing the time needed to bring all the participants to the transformation process on the same level. This is not new in Europe. Europe has been coping with adjustment of the most recent comers to the European Union process of integration with appropriate instruments. Now, after COVID, and we have in Europe introduced a major change, institutional speaking, like Next Generation EU, which on the one hand is very rich in terms of resources available, although could be richer, some would say, but also it implies that new resources are directed towards sustainable investment. So there is a policy and an historical drive to deal with differences, which in my view should be exploited as an opportunity, even if, as I said, at the end of this process, we will see differences in production and consumption patterns. There is another point on this which is closely related. What do we do as Europeans with the non-Europeans? What do we do at the border? Are we ready to accept the introduction of border taxes or border instruments to cope with differences in environmental activities, with a carbon tax or a border carbon tax? Again, this is sounds like a technical problem. It's a highly political problem. And I hope that Europe finds the political drive and leadership to go ahead, even if this implies being a difference with other parts of the world. But this is, I think, it's a way of asserting leadership in Europe and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Piercarlo. I saw Miss Beata Jaworczyk that raised a hand and probably wanted to say something about the integration of SMEs in global value chains. Miss Beata Jaworczyk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So this comes back to the first question about what could be done to help integrate SMEs into global value chains. As we impose more stricter requirements on firms in rich countries to report standards that they comply with in their global value chains, they will be tempted to push out SMEs from their supply chains, simply because it's much cheaper to monitor a lower number of suppliers. The cost of sourcing from SME or the benefits of sourcing from an SME will be smaller than the cost of monitoring compliance. So in order to facilitate inclusion of SMEs in global value chains, we need to lower those compliance costs by helping SMEs obtain various certifications, right? Whether these are certifications pertaining to environmental standards, to quality control. And, you know, even in my own research, I looked at the impact of obtaining ISO 9000 certifications on firm performance. And what you see very clearly is that it leads to higher sales, higher exports, higher wages, higher productivity. Part of it, it's signaling effect, which helps firms become suppliers to multinationals, to firms operating abroad. Also, what international community can do is to run supplier development programs. Very often, small firms, local firms, do not understand the requirements of multinationals when it comes to supplying them. And you know, breaking, again, it's about breaking these information barriers. It's about getting SMEs and multinationals together in one room to help both sides understand how gainful relationship can be struck. Finally, I think trade finance, an issue that was touched upon earlier in this discussion, is crucial. SMEs are often not considered to be risky business partners. So it may be harder for them to import unless they can prepay. But of course, prepaying is costly. They don't always have access to financing. So obtaining insurance through instruments such as letters of credit is crucial. I see Marco nodding his head. What we saw over the last 2 decades is breakdown of relationships between banks from industrialized countries and their corresponding banks in emerging markets. And to a large extent, this is due to the high costs of implementing anti-money laundering legislation designed to limit financing of terrorism, know your customer legislation. And again, I think in the times of greater uncertainty, trade finance is needed more than ever. The EBRD operates in trade finance space, and what we saw very clearly during the pandemic was increased demand. So if we want SMEs from emerging markets to export, we need to make sure that there is adequate access to trade finance instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Javorczyk. There's a question that are very much related to that, and you mentioned Mr. Marco Felisati, and the question asks for a business perspective on what are the possible tools or measures to facilitate small and medium enterprises access to trade finance. That is one of the main barriers to small businesses access to global value chains. Mr. Felisati, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I'll take up right away what Beata has just said by echoing it. The most straightforward solution could possibly be intervening in the Basel III agreements and make trade finance as a standalone asset class. It is as simple as important, because if you mix up trade finance with other criteria, then of course it will be less appealing for banking, insurance, and financial institutions. If you build up a standalone asset class and you give dignity to trade finance, then you make a concrete step ahead and you move towards small business. Then there can be many other actions, for example, further strengthening the role of export agencies at national levels by extending their scope of application, by boosting their business matchmaking capacities, by providing further tools to company to better identify partners around the globe. But if you want to tackle the critical issues from its roots, then you have to go back to Basel and make a coordinated action. This is something that the B20 will call upon the G20. And since they have the word, I maximize the opportunity to come back to the point of a fund at G20 level to easy technical assistance to small business for going much greener, which is of course a wonderful idea. I was simply wondering whether the G20 is not an organization, it's neither an institution nor I can hardly see the G20 handling a fund on its own. Normally, what the G20 does is to task an international organization for managing such instruments. In this very case, who would you think would be most suitable as an international or multilateral organizations or financial institutions or whatever would be to gather resources, make the necessary set up, and then implement this fund? Because having a fund is one thing, making it working effectively and monitoring that resources are allocated in a rewarding way, and most of all in most promising sectors and actors and projects and ideas, then requires a number of technicalities that, in my view, are not in the hands of the G20 as it stands today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Felizati. There is a question for Mr. Mario Cimoli, relating to the globalization trend that is ongoing, and the question is if it is a result of a lack of efficient global governance, or do you think it reflects objective mega trends originating from new technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolutions, which creates the basis for restructuring and reformatting of existing GVCs?
Thank you, grazie Fabrizio. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have this question. I think you know, there is good sentence that I like it very much. I think it's a moment to quote, because everybody in this global context is I want to say this. You remember when I think people attributed to Einstein that said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I don't know if you recognize that. What is clear behind this sentence? Our view is that everything is changing. Everything is changing. But it's not the change is not going to see now in this month, the next one or the other. Look from the crisis of 2008. Production processes changing. Inside the film is changing. The way that film is increasing productivity, the layout of the plant, the strategic process. The film is not really more just in time, it's changing just in scope. Everything is changing. And that means that we are designing new industrial policy. We have to rethink at these processes at the micro level. Microeconomics here is crucial one to understand that, to elaborate a good industrial policy. In this context, a platform for ICT are important also, because you are understanding that today you have an enormous asymmetry. I want to say this again, because the new process, how ICT technologies is incorporated in production, in distribution, and market structure, is not the problem the country by country. It's a problem of the global economy. Many of these firms has an enormous profit in different areas of the world, and you know, there is regions that don't have the fiscal capability to intercept some of the resources that are required to elaborate an industrial policy and social one. And this is an important agreement. If you ask me that, I think technology is crucial. It's not only technology, it's the convergence between new technology. Technology is always the result of social construction, you know? It's not technology by itself, technology. This pandemic, the crisis of 2008, the new technology is going to create a new process, and we have to rethink completely. For example, small and medium firms are not the same that was 10 years ago. The problem of skilled people required is completely different. Global value chain is going to be more virtual than effective. Everything is changing. New industrial policy. In that sense, I think countries like regions, like Europe, like United States, others are rethinking of this process. You can 5G, for example. They decided we have to buy 5G from China, Europe, and the United States. You know? One created, the other want to create it, the other is only regulated. Now, this process, everybody is understanding that the micro, the creation is different. In that sense, I think you put clearly, I want to insist in that. If we don't create this dialogue of industrial policy, accepting an asymmetry, accepting the role of these new firms at the global level, we are very worried about not only the instability of different countries in Latin America or Africa, but think about that. I want to tell only one number. Latin America, this pandemic is to remain with 50% of informal employment. 50%. You know what that means? People has low productivity, low inclusion in local value chain. We need to absorb. Latin America has an enormous responsibility to rethink the new industrial policy in technology. But the global agreement, the G20 has an enormous view to include this process and to have a more, I want to say, more partnership in industrial policy, more partnership in technological policy, more dialogue. What Beata said about small and medium firms is crucial one. We have 80% of the employment people in small and medium firms. We don't create a possibility, but it's not only our problem or our policy, the dialogue, accepting asymmetries, putting asymmetry on the debate, and thinking that the new industrial policy and employment are not to be the same that we thought 20 years ago. That's the crucial. But I think the combination of this crisis, the 2028 pandemic, and new technology are converged and the new completely different paradigm.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cimoli. We just got another question that can be very fruitful for our discussion is to Ms. Koch Hamilton and Ms. Jovochik. Please let me know what you want to reply on it. Our audience said data at firms level is very limited. Don't you think there should be an effort at the international level to produce good quality data to allow researchers and policymakers for a better understanding of the global value chains phenomenon?
A lot of data is available to researchers. The World Bank has put together data set on sort of summary statistics based on transaction level data from various countries. So you can get a lot of information about number of firms exporting particular product in a particular year, average flow. We have world input-output tables. We have survey called BEEPS done jointly by the World Bank, EBRD, and EIB, where we ask firms about participation in global value chains. In many countries, researchers have access to customs data, which includes information on foreign partner and their status, whether or not they are multinational or not. So I think there are lots of figures available. They are not necessarily available in one place. But I think we have made enormous progress in accessing the data and actually researching GVCs.
Thank you. Just to agree with Beata, that we do have actually quite a lot of data. We collect and have done several surveys with thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises for SME competitiveness survey, as well as our SME competitiveness outlook, which we will of course publish this year. We have also collect data and provide information for our market access map, as well as for our standards map. So we have a lot of data that actually can be used and can be drilled down for policymakers to look at the overarching state of MSMEs and their engagement in GVCs. I think one of the fundamental problems sometimes is that when you're dealing with micro enterprises or very small enterprises, it is sometimes hard for them to engage in the way that they would like or that policymakers would need, which is why at another level, we also work with the business support organizations who tend to try to, collate and bring together at a meso level the kind of information that would be helpful to policymakers and others to provide the intervention needed. So it's a kind of dual approach that we work with in order to help. Data is going to be even more critical as we move forward in this post-COVID environment, and it's something that in addition to access to finance, is going to be crucial to help MSMEs recover and weather this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are starting to run out of time, but I would like to come back to an issue that was explored in this question and answer session at the beginning, but from another perspective. And this question is, I think, could be interesting to hear to Mr. Paduan and Mr. Bart's opinion. To foster the creation of a number of global value chains in the medical product sector to tackle COVID-19 and possible other pandemic threats. This may require massive transfer of technology along with relevant know-how and active training of personnel in the centers of technological excellence. Do you think is it possible, taking into account current international divides and disputes, as well as persistent nationalism and protectionism?
Well, certainly it is possible as long as my short answer would be as long as there are differences in returns of doing that is possible. It is possible to transfer technology that way. However, you can do it in a different ways, also according to the impact on distribution of wealth and welfare that entails. This has to do with the broader issue which the pandemic crisis has shown to be relevant. That is to say, how do we manage the threats of global pandemics when there is a shortage of production of, for instance, vaccines to deal with that? Is there a governance at the global level that allows not just to transfer technology, but to transfer Medicare and transfer healthcare and transfer drugs across internationally within a framework that allows for the production of global public goods such as healthcare at available rate? I think that we still have to understand the implications of that, and we also should learn from what we have seen recently. For instance, the decision of the United States administration initially to stop the export of vaccines because the interest of the US citizens came first, which is reasonable from a point of view of the US president, but it's more problematic from a global point of view. So my short answer to your question is that we need to sit down and develop the implications of a global health system, which is a global public good, in terms of governance, efficiency, and transfers. It's much like the reconstruction of the international monetary system after World War II. The threats are similar, and we know, because experts tell us, that we should be expecting more pandemic waves coming down the line, unfortunately. So let's learn from the past and put ourselves to the future with appropriate governance and resources.
Thank you very much, Piercarlo. I don't know if Mr. Butler want to add something on the issue.
I think the pandemic, as Mr. Paduan mentioned, is for us, it's an example how society has to learn to make things better. We are on the way to start better out from this pandemic and hope that we have another world and another situation in our global supply chains. But I think it's necessary on the level of G20 to talk about this topic. And I hope that more nations will be on the process to have a legislative initiative for their own enterprises and their own companies. The way the United States went on in the pandemic is not our way. We don't say Germany first. We gave half of our vaccines in the world over COVAX, and we gave 2 billion euros to COVAX to have a better delivering of vaccines in the countries, in the developing countries and the countries which are not highly industrialized. So we think the pandemic can be only successful fighting if we do it in the whole world and not only in the own nation. And therefore, we foster all our efforts to have more multilateral initiatives to get a better economy, to get a better situation after the pandemic, and to be better prepared for the next pandemic that will arrive someday, because we all know that the COVID-19 is not the only problem in the world, and we will see in further years another similar problems, and so it's better to be prepared for this. And this is our most important effort. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butler. Before to close the webinar, I would like to ask to Director General De Jong if he has any closing remarks or comments in view of the discussion. Thank you very much, Director General.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I enjoy the discussion very, very much because I listened very carefully each panelist with their very rich experience, also knowledge about how to move ahead with this global trade issue, which is so important for us to build back better, greener, and also to reach 2030 development agenda. I have a few quick points. I think it's from my mind and my knowledge, my operation in UNIDO. First is multilateralism, globalization. It is so important. We already coming at such a stage for the global community, prosperity for least developed countries moving ahead with the globalization is an important process. And the multilateralism is the only way for us to move ahead with this kind of cooperation. Second is we need to develop basic principles, basic international norm, and especially I heard the new generation of the trade investment agreements. This is very important for the globalization. It runs based on the principles or norms, standards, agreements. It cannot be run any way. So the second point. Third point, of course, we need a kind of forums, a kind of places to discuss, to develop some agreements. Also, the forum G20 is certainly is a very useful forum. I actually be involved before my UNIDO job, G20 for since its inception in 1999, when I worked at the World Bank. So it's a very useful forum for us to move ahead with some agreements or some discussion. The WTO also, some of the panelists mentioned that WTO is a very important place. And also maybe UN and other places actually could be a kind of forum to generate the consensus on the issue. And inclusiveness and sustainability, a very important issue being mentioned by all of you. I fully agree with that because inclusiveness, especially as a UNIDO's operation, we look at the LDCs, look at the least developed countries, look at the mixed countries, and how to actually support them to meet the international standards. This is an important task for us. I'll give you some of the UNIDO operation. example of the trade capacity building. We are so powerful in supporting the trade capacity building to our member countries. Quality infrastructure, laboratories. So Pakistan producing very good mango, but they cannot export. Global value chain, they cannot we help them develop laboratories, and then their mango export to UK and other countries. This is Ghana is a cocoa bean. They produce enormous good quality cocoa bean, make cocoa butter, cocoa oil, cocoa cake, but they cannot export. We help them build a laboratory and technicians, equipment bought from European countries. And then after that, they export all the 3 kind of products from the cocoa bean. So the training is so important. Through training, we issue the certificate to those SMEs, entrepreneurs, and they know how to actually meet the international standards. Finally, the technology exchange. This is also one very general practice we are doing. South-South cooperation is so important, as Pamela mentioned, and the North-South is also important. Developed countries should actually support developing countries in terms of technology exchange. So the sustainability, green standards, I really enjoy the latest development. So many countries committed to the Paris Agreement, 2050, 2030, 2060. I enjoy that very, very much. But as a UNIDO, Industrial Development Organization, decarbonization of industry is so important. We just initiate that as an initiative jointly with the UK and also India. SAM, a Clean Energy Ministerial meeting just completed. We initiated that. So maintain the trade of the green is so important. It's also one of the issue, one of the important tasks for us to support those developing countries to cross the boundary of financing, technology, and the cost, the many of the issues to getting closer to the international standards. That is what we are doing. So I enjoy the discussion. I learned a lot from the panelists and how to move ahead with this important job, promoting the trade with inclusiveness and sustainability, and also based on the new generation of the agreement. Thank you very much. You need to always try to support all of you and support our member countries. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General Li Yong. And of course, thanks a lot to Mr. Kuniyoshi, the Director General UNIDO. And it was also a pleasure for us, for the Institute of Fund International, to jointly organize this webinar with all the UNIDO staff and our cooperating partners here, Institute for the World Economy and GIGA. Thanks again to all the participants for the contribution, to the audience for the kind attention and engagement and solving questions. As part of the G20 Italy process, we collected lots of contribution and feedbacks on our works and proposal. It's going to be important for us along this G20 Italy process with the final aim to provide research-based recommendation to the G20 Italy. Now I think we can close the webinar. I wish all of you a good end of the week and a lovely weekend from the G20 Italy. Thank you very much.